The American-Russian peace initiative, despite sustained efforts by Donald Trump and his envoys, has still failed to produce any breakthrough or halt to the fighting. All indications suggest that Kyiv is prepared to accept a number of deeply unfavorable terms for a simple reason. Ukraine is approaching the limits of exhaustion. It is true that Russia also faces serious difficulties, primarily economic in nature. Yet, like a wounded, starving vulture sensing weakness in its battered prey, Moscow feels Ukraine's growing vulnerability and the quieting support of some of its key allies. For that reason, the Kremlin has little interest in ending the war now. It believes it can extract far more by letting the conflict continue. The closing weeks of autumn merely extended and intensified trends already visible throughout the summer. On the battlefield, Ukrainian forces remain largely reactive, while Russian troops are ramping up offensive operations along selected axes. Fighting is currently underway for control of 8 Ukrainian cities. And after nearly 4 years of relentless combat, Ukraine's overstretched military is yielding ground at an accelerating pace. So what exactly lies behind this picture? Why is Ukraine facing an exhaustion? Let's begin by looking at the map. As 2025 draws to a close, Ukraine's armed forces have been unable to launch any major offensive operations, focusing instead almost entirely on defense while reassessing their prospects for battlefield success. Rather than repeating the unsuccessful attempts to regain the initiative in Zaporozhye in 2023 and during the raid into Russia's Kursk region a year later, Kyiv has shifted this year toward airstrikes on Russia's rear, targeting oil and energy infrastructure. While the effectiveness of these attacks is unquestionable, their immediate impact on frontline dynamics remains negligible. At the same time, Russia has not only intensified its ground offensives, expanding the number of active attack axes, but has also markedly escalated airstrikes against Ukraine's critical energy, gas and heating infrastructure. Throughout the autumn, Russian operations continued to focus primarily on Donetsk, but their most significant territorial gains were in Zaporozhye and the Dnipropetrovsk oblasts. Since late July, Russian forces have increased pressure south of the regional capital of Zaporozhye, aiming to push Ukrainian units out of northeastern Kherson Oblast. After capturing the village of Kamyanske in July, they pushed toward Stepnohirsk. Repeated attempts to seize the settlement mostly failed, but the situation changed late last month when Russian troops secured microdistrict number 3 in the village's southern section and then broke into the main residential areas. Two factors drove these advances: persistent fog, which degraded drone-based Ukrainian defenses, and the emergency redeployment of Ukrainian units from this sector to reinforce other threatened fronts. One crisis generated another. Although fighting in this area remains secondary to Moscow's more strategically important axes, further progress would bring Zaporozhye's southern districts within range of Russian FPV drones. Farther east, Russian forces conducted fixing operations along the Orikhiv axis. Several dozen kilometers farther east, the situation has shifted dramatically. For months now, Russian forces have been conducting operations along a broad, roughly 50-kilometer front, advancing westward toward the city of Huliaipole and the town of Pokrovsk from the east. This is where Moscow has achieved its most substantial territorial gains. Over the past 4 months, the front around Huliaipole has changed rapidly. Russian units advancing from the east have pushed roughly 30 kilometers forward, reaching the eastern outskirts of the city. All Ukrainian efforts to hold the advance have thus far failed. The natural defensive line along the Yanchur River was breached almost immediately in the second half of October, enabling Russian forces to approach Huliaipole directly from the east and begin operations aimed at cutting the vital road linking the city with Pokrovsk. In recent days, Russian reconnaissance sabotage groups have repeatedly entered villages north of Huliaipole, effectively confirming that the main supply route has been severed. Farther north, in a separate operation along the southern bank of the Vovcha River, Russian forces advanced approximately 30 kilometers westward, pushing Ukrainian units out of southwestern Donetsk Oblast and penetrating more than 25 kilometers into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. Dozens of settlements fell in this drive, including Zeleny Gaj, Vorone, Ternove, Novoivanivka and Vesele. As a result, Russian units moved closer to Pokrovsk, secured the Vovcha's southern bank, and launched initial attempts to cross the river near Velika Mikhailivka. Taken together, these maneuvers mean that Russia, attacking from the east, is gradually rolling up Ukrainian defenses originally positioned to face a southern assault. After the fall of Vuhledar in late September 2024 and Velika Novosilka in January this year, Russian forces gained the opportunity to outflank Ukraine's fortified lines. Operating from the Kurakhove area, they advanced roughly 75 kilometers west over the past 11 months. This leaves about 70 kilometers to the eastern outskirts of Zaporizhia, and if the current tempo holds, Russian troops could reach the regional capital by the end of next year. Given Ukraine's limited reserves, the flat and open terrain, and the absence of natural defensive barriers, the prospects for stabilizing this axis remain low. There is a growing risk of cascading collapse, a roll-up of entire fortified front from the Huliaipole-Pokrovsk line to the former Kakhovka reservoir. Such a development would threaten the vital logistics hub of Pavlohrad and could open the way for a Russian approach toward Zaporizhia from the east. The key driver behind Russia's rapid gains in the south, despite deploying limited forces and initially treating these operations as auxiliary to push toward Pokrovsk, has been Ukraine's critical manpower shortage. Across multiple sectors, the same problem has emerged: too few soldiers to contain Russian assaults. Russian air dominance, monthly salvos of thousands of glide bombs, superior artillery, sustained rear area strikes using Geran drones and ballistic missiles, localized superiority in FPV drones, and continuous ground pressure have produced losses that Kyiv has been unable to replace due to ineffective mobilization. Defensive lines became understaffed, gaps appeared, and Russian forces exploited them through small unit infiltration tactics. Further setbacks stem from command failures and coordination problems within the 17th and 20th Corps responsible for the sector, poor information flow between commanders, and the deployment of poorly trained territorial defense troops with low morale. Ukraińska Prawda reports that chaos following Russian strikes led to the temporary loss of command control over elements of the 125th Mechanized Brigade. Parts of the 102nd Territorial Defense Brigade had reportedly received no prior training. Another growing factor is the entrenched culture of false reporting. Present since 2022, it has become destructive amid Ukraine's mounting weakness, exaggerating own capabilities, concealing enemy advances, and delaying admission of lost positions, producing a distorted, alternate reality disconnected from the front. As Ukraińska Prawda wrote in its investigation, quote, "The scale of deception is enormous. Everyone reports only good news upward. Truth-tellers are dismissed and replaced with people who say, 'Yes, sir.' Headquarters see one reality, the front line another." Drone Unit Commander Ihor Łucenko adds, "When enemy captures a position, it is reported as ours. Only after all attempts to retake it fail is it declared lost. They lie about missing soldiers who are clearly dead, about weapon readiness, and about the number of drones shot down." Criticism has also targeted assault formations subordinated to General Syrski. These units have taken heavy losses in repeated stabilization and counterattack attempts, earning the reputation of meat units. Manco lies, and these firefighters often humiliate people and achieve little. More often false reports, wasted manpower and heavy losses than real results, said Serhiy Filimonov of the Da Vinci Wolves Battalion. This criticism reportedly contributed to the decision to cancel plans for creating centralized assault forces under Colonel Manco's command. Another factor was Ukraine's self-imposed reduction of defensive strength by redeploying units to sectors believed at the time to be more threatened. One crisis again bred another, confirming Russia's operational flexibility, intensifying pressure wherever weakness is detected, while pausing attacks where defenses prove stronger. As a result, Russia's infiltration tactic proved highly effective. Small assault infantry groups were pushed through porous sections of the front line, then assembled behind Ukrainian positions, cut defenders off from the rear, and gradually seized villages abandoned by thinly manned units. The autumn period of fog and rain amplified the impact of this approach by degrading Ukrainian reconnaissance and strike drones, the backbone of the country's defensive doctrine. Facing manpower shortages, Ukraine this year attempted to base its defense primarily on FPV drones and artillery. This proved partially effective against Russian mechanized assaults, but far less so against small infantry units infiltrating defensive lines. This pattern has repeated across nearly all axes of Russian advance. In many sectors, only a handful of soldiers now defend each kilometer of front line, often with lower morale than 2 or 3 years ago. It quickly became clear: drones are no substitute for infantry. By late summer and throughout autumn, the main weight of Russia's offensive remained concentrated around Pokrovsk. In early August, Russian forces achieved a tactical breakthrough north of the city toward Dobropilya, driving a wedge more than 10 kilometers deep into Ukrainian positions. This threatened the integrity of defense and created the risk of severing critical supply routes, including the Dobropilya-Kramatorsk road. After Russian units breached the so-called New Donbas line near Zoloty Kolodias and Kucherev Yar, Ukraine rushed elite brigades into the sector, halting the advance and recovering most of the lost ground over the next 3 months. The price, however, was exhaustion of reserves that were then unavailable for other threatened sectors, both in the south and around Pokrovsk itself. Over the summer, Russia gradually began enveloping the city from the east and then from the north. Sustained bombardment broke successive defensive lines, while assault infantry infiltrated weakened positions. This allowed FPV drones to gain control over key access routes, choke logistics, and effectively cut off entry to and evacuation from the city. Continued pressure led to direct infiltration from the southern axis in September and to Pokrovsk's relatively rapid collapse amid manpower shortages, supply problems, and Russia's overall battlefield superiority. A key factor behind Russia's success around Pokrovsk and neighboring Myrnograd has been the emergence of the Rubicon unit, an elite drone formation bringing together Russia's best UAV operators and receiving priority access to equipment. Its primary targets became Ukrainian drone operators, who are a critical pillar of Ukraine's defense amid acute infantry shortages. Rather than striking individual soldiers on the front line, Rubicon focused on paralyzing the near-rear logistics network, compounding the difficulties faced by Ukrainian units holding the sector. The result of Russian superiority and Ukrainian weakness has been the near-complete capture of Pokrovsk and the severing of Myrnograd from its support base. In Myrnograd, up to several hundred Ukrainian soldiers remain encircled, with no realistic prospect of relief. In early December, responding to the General Staff's continued optimistic statements claiming the situation was under control, surrounded troops began sending evidence to journalists documenting their dire conditions, hoping to compel commanders to attempt a breakout operation. Meanwhile, Russian forces systematically dismantle remaining Ukrainian strongpoints using heavy aerial bombs and sustained assault pressure from the south and east. North of Pokrovsk, fighting continues for Rodynske, where Ukrainian counterattacks have failed thus far. Roughly a dozen kilometers to the northeast, after months of Ukrainian pressure, Russian troops regained the initiative, capturing the ruins of Szakove and advancing into Sofivka. These moves may be preparatory steps toward a broader offensive aimed at Konstantinivka-Druszkivka axis, potentially driving toward Mykolaipilia to sever the road linking the two cities. Konstantinivka itself has already become a frontline city. After the capture of Toretsk, Russian forces took control of villages between the two urban centers and are now fighting for Konstantinivka's southeastern districts, where they have established a permanent foothold. At the current tempo, Konstantinivka is likely to become the next major objective following the consolidation of the Pokrovsk-Myrnokhrad agglomeration, which could serve as a logistical base for further advances toward Konstantinivka and Dobroblilia. Another intensifying hotspot is Siversk, now also effectively a frontline city. After more than 2 years of relative stability, Russian troops in recent months advanced steadily toward the city from the north, east and south, capturing Serebrianka, Verkhnokamiańskie, Wyimka and Zwanivka. By late November, they entered Siversk itself. Continuous precision airstrikes, infantry infiltration tactics, and Ukraine's manpower shortages ultimately broke the defenses around the city. Fighting for Siversk continues, with Russian forces already pushing into the city center. On the northern bank of the Donets River, after pushing Ukrainian forces out of the Serebriansky forest, which for more than 2 years has served as a key defensive position, Russian troops captured Yampolivka, Zarishne and Yampil. This advance brought them to the outskirts of Dibrova, where fighting continues, and toward Liman, now the site of the third battle for the city during this war. Ukraine managed to blunt Russia's first attempt to establish a consolidated foothold inside Liman, but pressure remains constant. The Russian advance is coming not only from the east. After capturing Kolodyazy, Shandrycholove and Serednie, Russian forces are also approaching Liman from the north. Fighting is currently concentrated around Dobryshevo and Novoselivka. Further active directions include Kupiansk and Vovchansk. Large portions of both cities have fallen, driven as elsewhere by Ukraine's shortage of infantry. After months of relative stability, the situation shifted in autumn. In September, Russian units used the infiltration tactics pioneered near Sudzha, advancing toward Kupiansk through an unused gas pipeline. The lack of a rapid Ukrainian response allowed the attackers to consolidate and establish bridgeheads on the western bank of the Oskil River. In the following weeks, small Russian units gradually seized much of Kupiansk. Ukrainian counterattacks later halted further Russian advances and retook limited ground, but an attempt to cut off the Russian force through an assault toward Oskil failed. In Vovchansk, Russian operations resumed in late October and early November, after Ukrainian commanders, considering the sector stable, redeployed forces to Donbas. This enabled Russian troops to capture the northern part of the city, cross the Vovcha River, and slowly advance into southern districts amid limited Ukrainian resistance. While the fall of Vovchansk carries limited strategic consequences, the full capture of Kupiansk would force Ukrainian withdrawals from all territories east of the Oskil. In Sumy Oblast, the situation remains largely stable, as both sides have diverted the bulk of their forces toward Donbas. At the same time as Ukraine's ability to conduct both offensive operations and effective defense continues to erode, Russia has expanded offensive activity across an increasing number of axes. By late 2025, Russian forces are attacking simultaneously on multiple fronts, forcing Ukraine to disperse already scarce manpower. Since June, Russia has captured an average of 400 to 500 square kilometers per month, confirming a sustained strategic initiative. Operational tempo has remained steady, 150 to 200 assault actions daily. and roughly 200 glide bombs dropped each day. Russian production of FPV drones has now matched Ukraine's, while the usage of fiber optic drones has surpassed it. Given current battlefield dynamics and Ukraine's broader national situation, there is little evidence that Kyiv can solve its recruitment crisis, and multiple additional factors suggest the problem will worsen. In October alone, nearly 22,000 Ukrainian soldiers deserted or left their units without authorization. The trend has risen steadily since the second half of last year. Journalist Ihor Lutsenko warned that, quote, someone leaves the army every 2 minutes, noting that this figure reflects only reported cases, as many desertions go unrecorded. Alongside failed mobilization, this has become the Ukrainian military's most critical problem. In recent months, desertions have increased in parallel with rising Russian pressure and growing casualties, further discouraging forcibly mobilized soldiers from frontline service. The trend is feeding a vicious spiral. Fewer soldiers lead to battlefield setbacks, which in turn reduce the willingness of new recruits to fight. Desertion is also linked to a corrosive practice of paying to avoid frontline service. As Gleb Bityukov described, quote, I encountered units where soldiers pay their commander so they don't have to go to the front positions. If a combat salary is around 100,000 hryvnias, roughly half goes to the commander. He reports that the soldiers are at their posts, when in reality they are not. So on paper a company has 60 men, but in fact only 20 remain, sometimes even 10, far too few to hold those positions. Another central problem is the failure of the mobilization system itself. The overwhelming majority of new recruits are now forcibly conscripted. Mobilization is based on so-called busification, men being seized off the streets by territorial recruitment centers. The process is profoundly ineffective and largely serves to simulate mobilization rather than conduct it, highlighting the state's inability to organize genuine large-scale recruitment. Maintaining a facade of normalcy during a war of attrition against a stronger adversary comes at a direct battlefield cost. The scale of misjudgment among policymakers in Kyiv is illustrated by a decision to allow men under 22 to leave the country, a move apparently driven by political considerations. In practice, this deprived the army of a pool of recruits who would have been younger, fitter and healthier than those now mobilized. Today, the average age of Ukrainian frontline soldier is approximately 47 years. An attempt to avoid lowering the conscription age took the form of a voluntary recruitment program aimed at younger men. But it failed due to limited interest. According to a Reuters report, of 11 young volunteers recruited under the program, none remains on the front line. 4 were wounded, 3 went missing, 2 deserted, 1 became seriously ill, and 1 took his own life. The combined effects of growing casualties, desertions, and failed mobilization are dangerously low troop levels in frontline units, widening gaps in defensive lines, and further Russian advances. Until recently, Ukraine attempted to offset manpower shortfalls with drones, but as Russia's UAV capabilities expand, its assault tactics evolve, and weather conditions worsen, the effectiveness of this drone-centric defensive model is steadily declining. At the same time, Russian air pressure continues to intensify. Last year's strikes already caused major damage to Ukraine's energy infrastructure. This year, the campaign began earlier and has steadily escalated, employing attack drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles. Russia is not only ramping up weapons production, but also modernizing its arsenal to overcome Ukrainian air defenses. Targets remain critical energy assets, power plants, and associated infrastructure, with recent strikes increasingly directed at substations linked to nuclear power facilities. The heaviest damage has been recorded in the Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, and Donetsk regions. But serious impacts are also visible in Zaporizhia, Odessa, and Kherson oblasts. with regular strikes now extending into western Ukraine and the Kyiv area as well. From October through early December, Russia launched more than 10,000 drones and drone decoys against targets across Ukraine, along with roughly 470 missiles of various types. According to Ukrainian data, factoring in the known tendency to inflate reporting, missiles achieved hit rates of about 50%, while drones reached roughly 20% effectiveness. The rising effectiveness of Russian strikes reflects, in part, the modernization of ballistic missiles, which, according to US media, can now penetrate the protective umbrella of Western air defense systems, including Patriots. Reportedly, Patriot interception effectiveness fell from 37% in August to just 6% by September. Russia has also significantly extended the range of UMPK glide bombs, enabling regular bombardment of Zaporozhye, and has begun deploying Garand drones in FPV-style strike rolls, further intensifying pressure on Ukraine's logistical rear. The response to Ukraine's growing vulnerabilities will be continued escalation of Russian pressure. Rather than seeking a ceasefire, Moscow, aware of its battlefield advantage, will attempt to improve its negotiating position through force. There is therefore no reason to expect any slowdown over the winter. If anything, Russian operational momentum may accelerate even further.